Oh, kind of. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, if you want to start, you should be able to start now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome, panelists. Welcome, attendees. Welcome to Farpoint's panel. This wasn't the dystopia that we were promised. I'm not sure who's actually supposed to be moderating this panel. Did somebody actually suggest somebody? Or are we just going to sit down and fake it?
We can wing it as we go, I guess, because I know I wasn't informed of who the moderator was for this one. So.
Fine, then for right now, I'm going to sit down and wave my hand and pretend that I'm moderating. Hi, everybody. I'm Glenn Hauman, star of stage, screen, and Supreme Court cases. I am the big guy over at Comic Mix, a publisher of various comic books and graphic novels and news and reporting and other fun stuff. I'm also one of the members of Crazy 8 Press. I am the victim of the Crazy 8 book, They Keep Killing Glenn. Not that I'm bitter or anything about that. And let me introduce the panels. I would normally say to my left, but this is not a virtual thing, so I have to go to whoever's in the panel down in the lower left-hand corner. So we'll sit down and start with Sherri Woosley.
Hey, so I'm Sherri, and I'm an author. I have my book, it's called Walking Through Fire. And that's, of course, the Baltimore landscape on fire in the background. And I also have a short story coming out in Crazy 8's Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2021.
Yay, coming to stores very, very soon. Pre-order it now on Amazon Kindle. And to my lower right or in the bottom right corner of the screen, we have
Hey
Phil
everyone,
Giunta.
I'm Phil Giunta. I've been coming to Farpoint since day one back in '93. I write mostly speculative fiction. I have 3 paranormal mystery novels published, and going on at the end of this quarter, I'll have hit my 25th short story. I've also published in local writers groups anthologies, doing a lot of articles and essays as well. So I'm just here to discuss dystopia because it was something that came to my mind. Actually, I was going to suggest it, but someone stole my thunder on it for this con. So I'm glad to be talking about this.
Well, let's talk for a second about then dystopia and not the dystopia we were promised. I mean, there are so many people who were expecting us to be living in a dystopia, but this was not necessarily the one that we were thinking of. So let's face it, folks, when we were growing up, we anticipated that we were going to be living in a dystopia. And I'm going to ask, which dystopia did you think you would be living in? And I'm going to start with Sherri. Go ahead.
Killer bees.
Killer bees.
Killer bees. Yeah, in elementary school, we were told the killer bees were on their way. Okay, and there was nothing we could do. We just had to accept that and just be aware that at any point, the killer bees were going to take over.
You saw the movie The Swarm, didn't you, as a young, impressionable age, didn't you?
No, I didn't need to. My elementary school teachers showed us like slides or film strips or something. And yeah, it was in my head.
Mm-hmm. So I bet so you thought the Murder Hornets thing back in back in the summer of last year was just.
I was like, yeah, I'm familiar with this. They're definitely coming. Murder Hornets, that's just the next wave.
Phil, how about you? What were you expecting?
I was expecting Blade Runner. I was expecting overpopulation, which is where we're headed anyway. which would then, of course, breed disease, technological dystopia, and especially more recently in the last few years when you have the deep fake technologies, which
Mhm.
can be used to cause more trouble than good sometimes, and could lead to uh, or help prolong or promote dystopia.
For me, like any good child of the 80s, it was nuclear war. And specifically nuclear war by accident. Most of what we saw in about the mid 1980s wasn't even just nuclear war stories like The Day After or Testament or some of those stories. It was the stuff where it was things like the Men at Work song "It's a Mistake," of where a nuclear war happens by accident. Or if you remember, there was a short-lived, there were a couple of things where basically nuclear wars were going to happen just by mistake, that just somehow something was going to screw. War Games was a nuclear war happening by mistake, very nearly averted. There was a TV show that ran for, I think, like 5 episodes on Fox Network called Whoops, which was the post-nuclear apocalypse after an accidental nuclear, winter and all that. It's like, oopsie, we just destroyed the entire planet. Shucky darn. Let's have some laughs about that. I mean, I give them credit for it because that had to be the best pitch meeting ever since Hogan's Heroes. Hogan's Heroes. Okay, so we're gonna have this Nazi POW camp, and it's a comedy.
But wait, okay, what about that movie? And I didn't see it, but what about the Sharknado? Like sharks are like flying around, landing on people.
I see the note here from Maggie, as a matter of fact, from one of our commenters. Great white sharks coming up through the toilets and through the bathtub drain. Yeah. And Jaws 4, this time it's personal. Yeah, that's sharks were always a big thing, although if you lived in a landlocked area, I couldn't imagine it being that big of a concern, unless all of a sudden, as you point out, a tornado picking up sharks and then suddenly bringing them farther inland, which, as we know now, obviously is enough to spawn 5 movies.
Sadly.
Indirectly, though, Sharknado was indirectly responsible for one of the greatest dystopian moves that we ever had. And one of the greatest tendencies of dystopia. You may not know this, but for Sharknado 3, they were casting for the role of President of the United States. And Donald Trump was approached and really wanted to do it. But for some reason, they didn't get back to him. And I think they put in Charlie Sheen or something like that. Whoever they put in, some Hasselhoff, whoever it was. And I keep thinking that somehow whetted his appetite for being, for either being president, and he just felt, cheated that he never got a chance to do it. And now you have to sit down and go, if he'd only gotten that thing out of his system back in, 2014 or thereabouts, what sort of a different world would we be living in now? And but that's, I guess that'll be for the Altered States of the Union 2 anthology coming from Crazy 8 whenever I get around to it. It's funny because now that we are in, I don't want to say it's a complete dystopia. I mean, it's as with so many things, dystopias are, even except for something that's planet ending, like a nuclear holocaust or something like that, somebody still ends up being on top, and somebody still ends up being in general. And for the most part, it's not necessarily being Lord of the Rubble. It's usually a bit more than that. So even even the dystopia that we are currently living in, there are people who are up, there are people who are down. I don't think anybody expected the sort of slow motion dystopia that we're working our way into. I think everybody was sitting there looking and going, there's going to be some sort of a switch that's going to flip, and it's going to, and it's suddenly going to go from this to, raining squid or whatever it may happen to be.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it has been a slow downward spiral. And I think a lot of that has to do with, well, maybe not a lot of it, but a good part of it due to this country's rampant and inexplicable anti-intellectualism. When you have leadership that denies science, that dismisses scientific theory in favor of personal religious belief. And I'm not going to sit here and
Point
and
fingers at anybody in
don't-
particular,
and
but
point fingers at any religions or anything. That's not the point. The point is, we are fiercely anti-intellectual in this country, and when it's your citizenry, it's one thing. When it's your leadership, it's now you have people in decision-making positions in power who dismiss science, who mock it,
mhm.
who belittle it. And where does that take your society? If you continue to allow that, and it's been going on for a long time. I mean, from day one, there's always been a group of people who dismiss science, who laugh it off, who mock science. This is nothing new. Carl Sagan lamented this in many of his books and interviews throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s before he passed away in 96. So this, Harlan Ellison ranted about it oftentimes in his.
Oh yeah.
So this is, I think it has been a slow journey down this path, but I think when you have leadership now more than ever that, I don't know, when I was younger, I don't recall this much rampant hatred for science growing up, so vocal to a point where you would have a group of people so riled up by leadership that they would do what they did on January 6th, for example.
That's true. I mean, January 6th is a very bad warning. It's not even a warning sign. It's an outright escalation. It's an escalation of the stakes, for want of a better term. But the know nothing thing has been there for a very long time. I mean, I was reading about anti-vaxxers when the polio vaccine first came out, and it was actually anti-vaxxers who were, amazingly enough, chiropractors were against it because they kept insisting, no, polio is just a thing where you just have to align the bones properly. And there's been a lot of you talk about the citizenry. The problem is, unfortunately, we're in a democracy. So, the government is us. It's not, it's not that we are dealing with the divine right of kings. Unfortunately, this is supposed to be a citizenry that's supposed to be, involved and informed. And if 27% of the citizenry is outright, I don't want to say outright crazy, but in some cases, they're either outright crazy or the other half of them are so horribly misinformed about the way the world works and the data inputs that they're getting that they might as well be crazy.
Well, and I think this is why our job as artists is so important, right? Because what we do is we see the fear and we're predicting if we go down this path, here's where it will lead.
Right.
That's why we have this whole genre of dystopian fiction, right? Because we're the ones who are not just looking at what the next step will bring us, but what is this logically going to do if we follow this way of thinking 5 more steps down the line, right? And I think that artists is kind of our job, and that's why we've created this whole genre.
Right, exactly. There's the line about from Ray Bradbury saying, "I don't try to predict the future; I try to prevent it."
Right.
And there's a lot of that goes. There's certainly enough of that. I would make an argument. I was having this discussion with Charlie Strauss, the writer of the laundry books and Saturn's Children and other fun things like that. And I think the secret of science, in some ways, one of the secrets of science fiction is that we're not necessarily, every one of us is a satirist. We're just satirizing where we think the future is now and where it's going to go if this goes on. It's not necessarily being heavily predictive or saying, what the trends are going to be. It's basically satirizing the stuff that's already out here and just taking it to whatever the next ridiculous extreme is going to be. And then playing out the implications thereof. And it's turning it, I mean, what's interesting is what we, is there are a lot of dystopias that seem to have a, shall we say, similar starting point, whether it be ignorance, whether it be, and sometimes it's just bad luck, but more often than not, it's not bad, it's not just bad luck. It's usually also the consequence of this happening, this happening, and this happening. It's kind of like when 9/11 happened, speaking of a different dystopian future, there were lots of people who kept saying, who could possibly have foreseen this? And I remember on that day watching CNN, because they got Tom Clancy on the phone and they got Tom Clancy in the studio discussing this. And Tom Clancy's novels had, a plane crashing into the Pentagon, crashing into the Capitol building. It was in Dead of Honor, taking a fully loaded airplane, crashing it straight in there and killing huge numbers of people. And it's not like Tom Clancy wasn't read in Washington, D.C. This was foreseeable, but nobody wanted to deal with some of the implications. There's a massive human failing that anything that is considered, any very, very small possibility of actually happening is, for many people, equivalent with it will never happen. Which is just not the case. It's, just because it has a very, very small chance of happening does not mean it has zero chance of happening. So just because, nobody's ever done this, just because a weather system has never come and hit Texas before like this, doesn't mean that it's not a possibility. Just because, a pandemic hasn't sprung, a virus that, humanity has no natural infection hasn't popped up in 50 years or 100 years, doesn't mean we're not due for another one. And just because we've gotten lucky with nuclear weapons so far, doesn't mean that somebody's not going to do something stupid somewhere along the line. And science fiction in some ways is truly, one of the anthologies that I've suggested for a Crazy 8 anthology at some point, we may end up doing Murphy's Anthology. Basically, applications of Murphy's Law, because most science fiction, about half of science fiction, and certainly 2/3 of film science fiction, are Murphy's Law stories. Act 1, we establish what the world is, we establish the technology, we establish the thing that makes it different. Act 2, something unforeseen as an implication of this new technology goes wrong. Act 3, hey, Gojira is coming to kill us all. That's what we get. That's what's, and I keep waiting for that same sort of problem that, what's the next problem that we're going to miss?
Well, I have a question for you guys. So, like in my novel, I start with a post-apocalyptic event and then it changes into dystopia. So how would you guys kind of define post-apocalyptic versus dystopia? How do they overlap, or what's the relationship there, do you think?
I always tend to think of post-apocalyptic is what Glenn referred to earlier, is that switch that's thrown and something instantly happens, like a nuclear holocaust of some kind, or some major, perhaps natural disaster that happens, that's immense and intense and brief enough, and people are caught unprepared.
Disruptive. Let's go with disruptive.
Disruptive.
Yeah.
And then the other side of that coin is dystopia is what happens after that now. Now we are living in dystopia because of this incident.
Right.
Life moving forward.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to have an apocalypse to have a dystopia. I mean, we didn't,
Right.
Although it also depends on how you define apocalypse. I mean, for Germany in 1933, what was happening with their currency and what was happening in their civilization, that's kind of an apocalyptic event. When you're carrying it, when you're using wheelbarrows to carry around your money, that's really bad. But it becomes, you don't necessarily need to have an apocalypse to have a dystopia. It can just be, a slow motion, ongoing train wreck that just eventually gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Mike Judge's Idiocracy, for example, is a simple example of just, take 500 years of, if this goes on, this is where we're going to end up.
That came to mind in the beginning of this conversation, actually, that movie.
So as far as an apocalypse, I mean, it's weird because, you don't need a dystopia. And in some cases, you could even make the argument that we've been living, we've been soaking in a dystopia, depending on who or where you are or what you're doing, we've been soaking in a dystopia now anyway. There are people right now who are in one of the richest countries in the world, were living lives of quiet desperation before the pandemic hit. There were people who were living, or all over the world. There's still starvation, there's still hunger, there's still dystopias all over the place, and we're just trying to claw our way out of them. And with varying levels of success, is the short answer. I go back and forth as to whether or not the pandemic is an apocalyptic event, but it certainly has laid a lot of previous assumptions to ruin. That I've been saying a lot, for example, that there are no libertarians in a pandemic, or at least not for very long. Just because it's very difficult to say, well, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do this alone, and what I do doesn't impact anybody else, and what anybody else does doesn't impact me. That's really tough to pull off in the midst of a global pandemic. Not that people aren't trying, but they're failing. And as a result, there are lots of things that people are coming up with that let's take the dystopia that we're currently living in, the pandemic. What assumptions have you previously held that have gone wanting in the last year?
I think the biggest one
Mhm.
is the common need and the common desire to help one another out the window. When you take a look at the people who refuse to wear masks, who refuse to do this, who refuse to do that, who said, I don't care if they die. They're already ill, they're already old, they're going to die anyway. Let them die. And that was eye-opening for me. Yes, I know there are greedy people and selfish people in the world and self-centered people in the world, who just psychotic people in the world who don't care about their fellow man. But to see this so blatant and so numerous, I don't recall in my past 49 years of living that many people, and it may be simply because now technology, social media, and the news has exposed us to more information for people and their opinions, that now we can hear people saying things that 20 years ago we never would have known, because it would have been in a newspaper in some other state that we never would have read. But now it just seems like this overwhelming selfishness in our society, this overwhelming, I don't care about the other guy. I don't
mind you. Yeah.
That combined with the anti-intellectualism, combined with the mockery of science, scared the hell out of me, because I thought, where the hell are we going as a society? Where the hell are we going? If half of us don't care about the other half, and half of us don't care about the other half based along political lines,
Right.
You're a Republican, you're immediately an enemy. If you're a Democrat, you're immediately an enemy. I saw that more blatantly in 2020 than ever before in my time. Yes, it's always been there since we've had political parties, but it just seems so raging and rampant and deep and fierce.
That 1/3 of the population is willing to kill another third of the population, while the third just sits by and watches. Is sort of
Yes.
thing. Yeah.
Over the fact that I am angry that I am forced to wear a mask.
Yeah.
during
Gosh,
a-
Carter, when is this pandemic thing going to be over? It's like, you think this is up for a vote? Yeah, exactly.
Right. That attitude, that mentality, I think only can promote the dystopia, can only just prolong it, deepen it, and it scares the hell out of me.
Oh yeah. Sherri?
I think a little bit kind of with what Phil was saying, what I realized because of the pandemic was how much each individual person is in their own echo chamber. And I hadn't realized it before. And we see that sometimes, like if you say something in your phone here, ad pops up on Facebook, right? So we have this idea that, okay, that we are being directed in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't realize until this pandemic that each of us is in an echo chamber. And so because we didn't have like kind of leadership for the pandemic, we weren't getting one unified message. It seems like everyone felt like they were on their own. They had to get their own information and make their own best decisions for themselves and their family. But their information, if I'm sitting next to someone, they could be reading articles targeted to them, and I am reading entirely different articles targeted to me, and we both think that we have the answer because of the information we're getting. We both feel like we're
Right.
making intelligent choices, even though the information coming in is so different because we didn't have one unified, hey, these are the facts.
Right.
This is what we're going to do. And so I was struck by people that I consider very intelligent people having such different opinions, because we all had to have opinions because we didn't have one global message. And
Right.
I just hadn't realized what that would do to our society.
Although the other side of that, of course, is that at a certain point, whatever bubble you're in meets the road. Whatever
Yeah.
bubble, you could have lots of very, very bad beliefs. COVID don't give a damn.
Right.
And COVID will sit down and just, hammer on you until, okay, well, I don't believe in COVID. That's nice. COVID believes in you. I don't believe,
But then like to argue and say, oh, well, it's just being called COVID because then the hospital gets more money.
right. I mean, some of this stuff is just, is ludicrous and insane. And and the number of people is like, I remember early on in the pandemic, before a certain individual blocked me, who just went, and he was going on about, where the hell are you getting your information? Well, how do you know so much? It's like, well, because I'm doing research and I'm checking with, actual authorities, like, the head of infectious disease research at, at Beaumont Health in Michigan, who's the biggest healthcare provider in Michigan. And here's what he's been telling me, and here's why, and here's the meme he's been sharing, and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, now, and the number of people is like, why aren't you listening to, wow, this is it. This is Fauci's big move, or this is all designed to make Trump look bad, or this is designed to, it's like, what? It is staggering to see some of the, not just, there's also the number of people who are engaged in a particular form of equivocation. If you've ever heard of a thing called a magician's force, where it's basically no matter what answer you come up with or what thing the audience comes up with, it somehow automatically gets clear to what it is that you want to talk about.
Okay.
The economy is doing great. We need to cut taxes because it should go back to the money, to the people who really earn this stuff. The economy is doing horribly. We need to cut taxes so that we can stimulate the economy. Maybe if it's the answer is the same to both, I don't think it's quite what you're looking for. It doesn't seem to be particularly responsive to the question. So, I don't know.
I was gonna say, so how do you think, having lived through this pandemic, having seen these things play out, how will your writing in the future be affected?
Oh boy. Other than just the ability to sit down for an hour and concentrate and be able to write. That's a really good question. And part of it is, do you want to forget about the thing that happened, or do you want to sit down and have it inform the thing that's coming next? And I think that obviously, if you want to be able to sit down and look at, the future, because the only future worth discussing is the future that we're living in. I don't know how entirely it's going to come out. I think that we're going to see, part of it is how does this world shake out as to what happens. I think that we're going to see a lot of additional metaphors coming, although it's funny because the zombie metaphor was kind of tapped out before the pandemic hit, and now some of it you're looking at going, geez, some of this is just absolutely, World War Z is almost a manual to how the entire planet was acting in the face of a global pandemic. Some countries were, doing these sorts of maneuvers to do it. Some of them were just shutting their borders. Some of them were doing it. I really don't know. I wish I could sit down and say, this is how it's going to affect things in the future, but I don't know. And I also don't know what the audience is going to want to see.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I write across a lot of different genres, and it's funny because one of the things that came up at the end of last year, one of the groups I belonged to was getting ready to publish their next anthology or plan for their next anthology. And in this case, because of what we had been through for the past, by that time it was 6 months into the pandemic, they want to steer away from darker themes. So they actually decided to publish an anthology called Love on the Edge, and it was all about love during a difficult time. And I
Okay.
thought that was very unique. That was very interesting because it tries to incorporate, yes, we are in a dark time, but how can we find something bright and positive during that time? So I wrote a story and published it with them. And it was very unique. It was probably one of the few times I think I'll probably include maybe direct references to COVID, because this was a conversation among a lot of writers, was eventually this will be in our rearview mirror. So how will it inform your writing later on? I thought, well, over the past 10, 12 years, I've not really included a lot of world happenings in my stories. Uh, but in this case, COVID was so extreme, touched everyone, it was unavoidable. So I
Mhm.
included it in this story for this anthology. Going forward, that all depends on genre that I'm writing in. If I'm writing something that's taking place in another part of the, obviously, some other world, some other galaxy, whatever, that's a different story. But not that this can't inform that. Certainly, I've learned more about attitudes and um, divisions among people and extremism among people. And growing up, you're always sort of almost brainwashed into thinking extremism happens over there. It's
Right.
over there in some other country. It's not here. We're America. We're the United States of America.
Mhm.
And I think 2020 slapped you in the face and made you realize, no, we are not the United States. If I see groups of people walking down the street waving Nazi flags that say Trump Pence, we're not a United States. There's a problem here.
Right.
And now that yeah, we've always had the KKK, we've always had these extreme groups, but if you're not living in certain areas, you may not be exposed to them very much. Well, guess what? Social media, the news,
They're working in your backyard and you didn't even know it. Yeah.
and here they are. They're in your face. You didn't realize it. Now you're exposed to all of this thanks to the internet, and you cannot ignore it anymore. I don't care what your teachers or parents or anything tell you about the country. Nope. Guess what? Your rosy picture of the United States has now just been flattened and destroyed.
Yeah. Surprise. Guess what?
So
Yeah. It's,
now that so now that you see these types of people in the world, you have these characteristics of people around, you've lived through it. You may not necessarily write a dystopian novel or an apocalyptic novel, but you have more material now to work with. Types of people, archetypes, these kinds of personalities that you can draw from to create characters.
I think one of the things that you at least find different is if you came from a comic book background like I did, doing a lot of stuff, there's a certain point where you're sitting down going, wait a minute. So nobody believed Jor-El when he told the Science Council that the planet was going to explode. And they just went on and continue, and you sit down and go, they just continued on their merry way. And Jor-El was, and you sit down and go, nope, I can believe that now. I can. But it's funny that the one odd thing about this particular apocalypse, for want of a better term, is that it's actually the closest thing that we've had in literally in about 20 years that is worldwide in the consciousness. Everybody on the planet knows about the pandemic in some form or another, in a way that we haven't had a uniform, that people have heard since 9/11. That there is one universal touchstone event that we can all sit down and go to. Sherri was talking about before about everybody being in a bubble. This is the one event that basically crossed every single bubble line that could possibly be. Everybody heard and knew about the pandemic because there were shutdowns all over the planet. There were people who were sick all over the planet, everything else like that. They at least heard that it was that it was happening. As compared to choose an example, Jade Helm happening in Texas, or the Fast and Furious scandal over here, or this governor getting in stuff here, this was something that was as close to planet-wide universal as we could possibly get. And it's funny that now, as we're saying, we don't necessarily want to reference it again in our fiction, or we don't want to reference it everywhere else because everybody else kind of knows about it, but it's also at the same time, we kind of want to forget about it. if you look back at the amount of popular culture that was coming out during the 1918 pandemic, for example, there's really very little. There's very little that has survived the era. There's very little of what people are talking, we're talking about then. You don't really see anything until after the pandemic's over and the jazz age starts. You've got World War I, and you've got the jazz age, and there are about 2 years in the middle there, 2 to 3 years where really nothing happens in American culture or world culture. Nobody has anything that's really worth talking about. Except for that, influenza thing that somehow just, killed 50 million people across the planet. But other than that, no, there wasn't really much going on. So, so I don't know. I'm just trying to think what other. It is a weird thing because it's also one of those things, particularly in television and movies and the like. There are some stories that have to deal with it. If you're doing a medical show, for example, if you're doing Grey's Anatomy, if you're doing you kind of have to address the fact that there's a pandemic going on. It's the big story that's going on in the world. But as you go back and watch, worry about the rerun life of some of these things, do people really want to watch this stuff in reruns over and over and over again? And that's going to be a weird question going forward. It's almost a bigger problem. I mean, the logistics going around shooting in the time of a pandemic are different, and storytelling, because it's one of those things where if you're writing a story either set present day or in the future, you kind of have to address this big planet-wide happening. But how do you do it? Particularly because we don't necessarily know how it's going to end. And I know the number of science fiction authors I know who have had to kill stories because, oh, look, this pandemic came along, so this near future, this version of what Scotland was going to look like in 10 years from now is now out the window. The only thing that makes it harder in some ways is the stuff that if you're writing period pieces and having to shoot things where, for example, people are up close and personal, and you can't do that under COVID restrictions. That's really, you can't really do a story about the swinging scene of the 70s and do it anything close to justice with COVID restrictions going on. Yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, I wonder, are people even going to shake hands ever again? Like, did shaking hands die in 2019?
How about blowing out birthday cakes? Candles on birthday cakes is another one. Did that disappear?
Yeah.
Polyamory was getting heavy footholds in America and worldwide before the pandemic hit. So did Tinder and casual hookups and things like that. That we haven't seen since I don't know, before the AIDS epidemic hit. And now, where the hell are we? Where are we going to be in 2 or 3 years? I'd be very curious to see what divorce lawyers are doing right now. It's funny because it's the side stories that are going to be interesting. A while back I had suggested I'd try to get in contact with people at Blumhouse Media, because they're the movie studio that does the Purge series, and I wanted to do an anthology filled with all the side stories of the Purge, not necessarily the big thing, but I wanted to see, here's the people who decide to get even with their boss on this particular night, or here's the people who decide to run a heist, or here are all the divorces that kind of happen, and then the divorces that are really just like as you're going through is the Purge story. And I wanted to see how some of those stories affected the world, and I haven't seen anything like that. I don't know.
I'm almost certain there'll be some reactionary literature coming out from this. I'm almost certain there'll be some stories from, and there already have been actually. I know last year some small presses that I happened to come across on some of my Facebook groups are, give us your stories from the pandemic. What was your life like during this time? And in fact, here's a good example, and not even a small press, a major publisher, Chicken Soup for the Soul. They run, as they publish a book every 2 months with a different theme. Right now on their website, if you go there, they're running a bunch of open calls. Last year, there was one called Making Me Time, taking care of me during a stressful time. And they bullet pointed a list of stressful situations. Of course, one of them was COVID-19. Right now, I just submitted to another theme called Tough Times. What do you do and how did you survive tough times? And of course, at least a third of that bulleted list was working from home during COVID-19, taking care. How do you handle? You have an elderly parent in a nursing home you cannot see because of COVID-19. Different difficult times caused by COVID-19, but you can also write things outside of COVID-19. It doesn't have to be COVID based.
Right.
But we see this now in our literature, even now, that people are looking for stories during the pandemic. So.
Yeah.
But we did have the Spanish flu of 1918, right? And at some point in time after that, we became comfortable again, didn't we? We became complete. We
did.
were shaking hands again. We were kissing and smooching again. We were hugging again. We were doing all the social activities
We
again.
forgot all the things that we learned from the previous, as the previous generation died out.
Right. And so,
Well, we were looking towards killer bees.
yeah, there you go. Right.
Yeah, or the Ice Age. Remember
And
when the Ice Age was a
Sharknadoes,
thing? Yeah.
everything else. But I think as a society, I think it's people have a burning desire and a need for normalcy, to go back to the way things were when they were comfortable. So eventually, I think we're going to go back to shaking hands, and we're going to go back to sitting in a restaurant. Well, people are sitting in restaurants now, but we can go back to taking the masks off and going to eventually.
Sooner or later, one of
fall
these days.
back into that comfort again, the society, the normalcy that we want. We did it
Right.
before, we'll do it again. And then, of course, maybe another pandemic in 100 years or 70 years or whatever it's going to be.
And we get to do the entire thing all over again and see how fast it.
Exactly. That's part of the reason why I think I can't speak for people in the 1918 Spanish flu. I can always, I've read a little bit about it. There were protesters, or people didn't wear masks. There were, it was same kind of mentality back then, but I wasn't exposed to that. I'm here now, and what I see are a lot of impatient people who want life to get back to normal. I mean, there were, my company that I work for, I have a day job doing IT tech support, and our company on Friday the 13th of March said everyone's going to start working from home on Monday the 16th. I'm like, guys, you're giving me like a weekend to get 100 people set up for home use. Thank you. No stress there at all. No pressure. But I remember, talking to friends in March and April, and they were saying things like, the warm weather will burn this away. COVID will be gone when the summer comes. And my wife and I were talking about this. No, guys, I really don't think that's the case. I don't think that's going to happen. Or, it'll be fine by the fall. It'll be gone. It'll be and of course you had the people believing our former president, who said, what did he say? To paraphrase, like a miracle, one day it will disappear. And I'm like, don't please don't say, this is our leadership. Please, leadership, don't say things like that.
Yeah, don't say the obviously stupid shit. But
please don't, because then unfortunately we have people in this country who are dumbed down enough to believe that QAnon, excuse me, who believe conspiracies and outlandish and ridiculous things and take them as gospel truth. And that's part of the reason why we are in a dystopia, because we have people who cannot critically think. They believe whatever they're told to them.
Yeah.
So
grumble, bitch phone, grumble. Yeah.
But eventually, to Sherri's point, I think, yes, eventually 2022, I don't know, we'll get back to a critical mass of population being vaccinated. And then at that point, maybe we'll be like, oh, okay, numbers are going down. People start shaking hands again, start gathering again. I don't know what that time frame looks like, but certainly it will happen. I'm pretty sure it will happen.
Sooner or later.
I mean,
probably.
There are discussions.
I mean, really, what are the odds that it couldn't? Yeah.
I mean, really, it's got to happen eventually. I mean, and people say, well, the flu, pneumonia, bronchitis, the cold. We've living with these things forever. COVID is the next thing. It was, is the next disease running through our society, and it's not going to go away. It's not going to.
And maybe we'll get an annual shot each year, just like you get a flu shot.
That will become the norm. It's here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. So how do we, as a society, adapt to this
ongoing pandemic, to this
new
ongoing
normal?
Dystopia? Yeah.
Well, new normal. Yeah.
Right. It's spoiler alert for The Walking Dead. Sooner or later, they do kind of build a civilization, and zombies are a thing that, you occasionally have to deal with, but they make changes. You burn the bodies, you do this sort of stuff. You try to, do stuff to avoid zombies coming back for you. It's like, okay, this is how we live now. This is, sooner or later it is, this is what we get back to. And this is, it's, you adapt. That's
Yeah.
in some ways is the worst part of the scary part of dystopian stories in some ways are the number of things that we look at and that we adapt to. The number of things that we look back at and go, how the hell did this happen? It's the line from Mad Men after somebody has an abortion. I won't tell you who, but a secret abortion. And Don Draper comes by and says, "This never happened. It will shock you how much this never happened." And it just goes for, it's like, this was something that was supposed to be huge and important and everything else. And then it just, nope, we adapted to it. One of the horrifying things right now indirectly about Facebook, other than all the other horrifying things about Facebook, is the anniversary stuff of, check your memories. And you look at some of the stuff that we were talking about 4 years ago in the early days of the Trump administration, and we forget about some of the shit that was going on. We forgot about the Muslim ban. We forgot about some of the regular norms that were just violated on a daily basis because we got used to them. And that's in some ways the worst part of a dystopia. I mean, it's the good news and the bad news. The good news is, yeah, sure, we'll adapt to climate change and eating crickets in the future and stuff like that. But, and then you sit there and go, what do you mean we adapted to eating crickets? Yeah, well, okay, so let me tell you, kids, back in the day, before we had this internet, and we had music that we had, it had to be stored on CDs that were this big, and they had so much music on them that they turned black. That's the sort of craziness, it's that we are going to adapt to some of it. And we're going to find out things that just, yeah, we were always living this sort of thing. It's, and until somebody comes along and says, why the hell are we living like this? And then busts the dystopia open, as happens in so many dystopian fictions.
True. And we have a
because I
comment
think
here. Go ahead, Sherri. I'll follow up.
Okay, I was just gonna say, when you do compartmentalize, it doesn't really just go away. And so you have trauma done across the generation. And that, I think, is what's building up to create almost like an abscess, right? And that's what we're imagining with the dystopia, is when the abscess breaks free and just sprays out, polluting everything, right? How's that image?
Lovely imagery, thank you.
We did have a comment from look at Triffid Matson talked about the compartmentalizing and then how you compartmentalize and it's not healthy in the long run, but you do that psychologically to get through it so that you can move forward. I know and that's another thing that to touch on is psychologically what we go through in a dystopia. We can talk about the ways dystopia can happen, the way the experiences of it, but also psychologically how you adapt and how you change as a person. I just had a conversation the other day with someone who in fandom, and we used to talk about fandom stuff all the time. Fandom this, fandom the latest Star Wars movie, the latest Marvel movie, the latest this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things that became very obvious over the last few years, especially in 2020, was that just seems so trivial now. I hate to say it. I'm not sure.
No,
I grew up. I mean, look around me in my background. I have nothing but Star Trek and Star Wars collectibles behind me, and that's what I love. But suddenly, I found myself over the last year thinking,
"Oh, I've wasted my life."
No, not so much that. I mean, I still believe in fandom. I still love Star Wars and Star Trek and all those other things. But suddenly, it just felt like I can't talk about this right now.
Right.
I've been working, with my job changing because of the pandemic, and not just that one incident I talked about, but since then. My day job went from 10 to 12 hours a day to sometimes 14 to 17 hours a day. And I suddenly found myself consumed with job, health, taking care of my home. And my God, I have to sit down and do some writing. And suddenly watching TV, keeping up with Picard and Discovery and Mandalorian and this show and that movie just didn't matter anymore. Survival mattered, psychologically and physically. And so when I turned around and started looking at fandom stuff, I'm like, okay, I'll get back to fandom later. But right now, I'm just trying to get by every day.
Sure, but by the same token, it's funny because what Sherri was saying before about being a writer and stuff, nobody got into being very few people got into being writers because they had happy childhoods. And
No comment.
yeah. I figured. The point is, I'm stealing right now from Stephen Colbert, because Colbert said this after Trump won, that nobody got into this for because they had happy childhoods, because it's their job to go out and try and create joy, to create levity, to go out and make you forget, for in the immortal words of Tom Waits, make you forget for a while your sad, pointless lives.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're in the middle of doing here, where we have to be able to sit down and make people, for some of us, it's the job to sit down and lighten people up, or otherwise give them something to, take away their troubles for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever that may happen to be, that's the job description. We have to sit down and take away, and make life a little bit more bearable without doing as much damage to your liver as gin might, as an example. So
is this the point where I confess that I watched Bridgerton?
Go ahead. Bridgerton's fine. You know what? If it gets you through and doesn't, if it gets you through and doesn't harm anybody else, that's fine. Look, and the other thing is, and this is one of the things that I keep reminding people about the pandemic and this dystopia. Right now, the human race is broken into two classes of people. The people who are trying to keep us alive through the pandemic and get the pandemic ended, and people who are in the way. Anything we can do to either help those people, or get out of the way is a good thing. Right now, that's pretty much where we are. So, my job is to get out of the way and otherwise lighten the load for everybody else who's trying to get through this. So we've got 5 minutes to go. So are there questions from the audience? Let's see, as I scroll back through. Phil, you've been following this a little bit more closely than I have.
There's nothing in the Q&A. There's been a lot of just comments.
Right.
Mostly talking about, again, compartmentalization to get you through, to help you survive, resilience and adaptability of society to get through. And I think that's also a major part of it. And that could also inform your writing as well. You could have characters. I mean, I'm always very open about the fact that I've suffered or struggled with depression and anxiety all my life. And so now you have a pandemic weighing on you, and you have these extreme work hours at your job weighing on you. And I'm a writer. I'm constantly writing. How can I balance all of that? Which would not have been a problem had it not been for the pandemic. So the pandemic sort of has these, as opposed, in addition to its direct symptoms and directly affecting your health, what are some of the side effects, the residual effects of this pandemic, how it affects your life in other ways, is also something that can inform your writing as well. So that's my final comments.
Fun stuff. Sherri, since that's Phil's final comment, what about yours? What's your take on all this?
Well, so I was just going to say that, I also have a story about hope coming out in an anthology in March. It's called Black Eyed Peas, an anthology of hope.
Okay.
And so I think there's this need to look at stories full of happiness and full of hope. And so I guess I will finish by saying I'm on Twitter at Sherri Woosley. My website is tasteofsherri.com.
Taste of Sherri. Sorry, I'm thinking of brandy and other stuff like that. I'm just going, Taste of Sherri, SHERRI. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
As with so many things, it's the dystopia that we're living in that is really, the good news is that if you've been following dystopian fiction for any amount of time, you have some idea of that it can get better, that you can spot the signs of a dystopia coming, and that you can make changes to it, either to get out from under it or to bring it to improve the situation for yourself and everybody else. And just a reminder that, as with any dystopia, you get the dystopia you tolerate.
Yes.
Folks, thank you very much for your time. Please enjoy the rest of your time at Farpoint. I'm not sure if we have a additional room where we're supposed to be hanging out afterwards.
You can hang out in Discord, or you can hang out on the Gather Town. These are two possible options, whatever works for you.
Okay. Folks, thank you very much for your time. Please enjoy the rest of the show, enjoy the rest of Farpoint, and hopefully next year in Hunt Valley.
Absolutely. Thanks, Glenn, for
Yeah.
moderating.
Take care,
Appreciate
folks.
it.
Have fun.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye-bye. That was fun.
Yeah.